human colony on the planet Karas 3 had seen its fair share of technological marvels, but nothing quite like the arrival of Vrexia, the alien maid from the Quathari species. Jordan was a middle-class entrepreneur living in a small, cluttered apartment in the bustling capital city, Dravenhar. Between work, social events, and the challenges of living in an intergalactic metropolis, his apartment had descended into chaos. After a week of failed attempts to clean up, he decided to hire help, a practical solution that had served him well before. What he didn't anticipate, however, was that his new maid would be from another planet entirely. The doorbell chimed with a mechanical ring that echoed through the hallway of his apartment complex. Jordan opened the door to find a slender figure standing in the hallway, a tall humanoid with smooth violet skin that shimmered under the artificial lighting. Her eyes were an intense shade of amber, and her 4 arms, each tipped with elegant webbed fingers, twitched with nervous energy. She wore a simple black uniform adorned with the insignia of the Quathari species, a symbol of their long-standing reputation as elite caretakers across the galaxy. "Hello, Mr. Jordan," the alien said in a soft, melodic voice, her speech slightly accented with the strange cadence of her people. "I am Vrexia, your maid. I will assist you with cleaning today." Jordan blinked, unsure how to respond at first. His last maid had been human, and he'd expected the same from his new hire. His hesitation was more about the fact that she was clearly from another world than anything else. But, as he stepped aside to let her in, he shrugged off the surprise and reminded himself that this was just a professional arrangement. "Great. Just be gentle with the tech stuff. Okay?" he joked, gesturing vaguely toward the scattered array of gadgets and wires in his living room. Vrexia nodded with the kind of solemnity that only an alien maid could muster. "I will proceed as you request. I must warn you, however, cleaning is not merely a task to me. It is a sacred ritual of my people. And you, Mr. Jordan, are the one I am to serve." Jordan, still caught off guard by her otherworldly presence, gave a short laugh. "Oh sure, a sacred ritual. Just don't break anything, all right?" He figured this was just her way of putting herself at ease, so he didn't think too much about it. Vrexia made no further comment as she entered, her 4 arms gracefully moving toward the piles of mess. With one set of hands, she began dusting the shelves, while the other set gathered dirty dishes from the counter. Jordan, meanwhile, collapsed into his couch, exhausted from a long day. He pulled up a digital news feed on his tablet, content to let her work her magic. However, it wasn't long before he noticed something strange. Vrexia didn't seem to be cleaning like a typical maid. She wasn't hurrying through the tasks. Instead, she moved in deliberate, almost ceremonial motions, each action seemingly designed for precision rather than efficiency. It wasn't just about tidying up. There was an elegance to her movements, a flow that was almost hypnotic. Jordan couldn't help but watch her. There was something mesmerizing about the way she went about her duties, something that felt intentional. As her arms swept across his apartment, she made an occasional humming sound, her amber eyes half-closed as if in deep concentration. When she reached his living room, Vrexia stopped by the sofa. "Mr. Jordan, I must ask, may I clean your personal space next?" "Personal space?" Jordan furrowed his brow, momentarily distracted from his tablet. "I mean, if it helps you get the job done, go ahead." Vrexia nodded in silence and set to work, using a specialized cleaning cloth she pulled from her belt. As she reached for his coffee table, Jordan watched with a strange mix of curiosity and amusement. But when her hands brushed over the surface of the table, she hesitated. Her 4 eyes flicked to him, their intense amber hue almost glowing. "Mr. Jordan," she began slowly, "this area is unsanctified. It is a place of entropy." She didn't wait for a response. Vrexia reached down, her fingers brushing over the table's surface with a slow, almost loving motion. Jordan raised an eyebrow. "Unsanctified? It's just my coffee table. No need to get all mystical about it." Vrexia ignored his remark. She tilted her head slightly, and with a sudden flourish, she began to swirl the cloth around in what appeared to be an intricate pattern. It wasn't a cleaning motion. It was ritualistic, She hummed softly under her breath as her movements grew more complex, each swirl of the cloth evoking a deeper sense of reverence. Before Jordan could ask her what she was doing, Vrexia spoke again, her voice more serious this time. You see, Mr. Jordan, cleaning is more than an act of tidying. To the Quathari, it is a form of bonding, a mating ritual. It is an exchange of energies between the caretaker and the cared for. She looked at him, her expression almost wistful. And you, Mr. Jordan, are the one I have chosen to bond with today. Jordan's eyes widened. Wait, what? But Vrexia was already moving again, unfazed by his confusion, her four hands weaving an intricate dance over his furniture. She had begun her ritual, and now nothing would stop her. Jordan was still processing what Vrexia had said, her words ringing in his ears. A bonding ritual. The idea felt absurd, utterly outlandish. He shifted uneasily on the couch, trying to focus on his tablet again. But the sight of the alien maid, no, the alien priestess of cleanliness, working around his apartment made it impossible to concentrate. Her movements were fluid, each motion carefully coordinated. As she moved to the next part of the room, Vrexia extended her hands, the two outer sets gesturing as if in some kind of dance, while the two inner sets cleaned. She seemed utterly absorbed in her work, her amber eyes glowing with a soft intensity. The atmosphere had shifted from the usual hum of his apartment to something more charged, more alive. Jordan leaned forward, suddenly feeling like an intruder in his own home. The thought of her cleaning as a mating ritual started to feel less like a joke and more like a statement of something he didn't fully understand. He had no experience with aliens, let alone alien customs. But what he did know was that, despite the absurdity of the situation, Vrexia wasn't acting in a way that suggested a prank or some sort of misunderstanding. She was earnest. She truly believed this was something sacred. Vrexia, he said, trying to sound casual but failing. What exactly do you mean by mating ritual? Are you saying this is like a date? Because if that's the case, I've got a lot to explain about human customs. Vrexia paused, her multiple eyes locking onto his, their golden hue piercing through him. Her expression remained unreadable. For a long moment, she simply regarded him in silence, the sound of her cleaning cloth against the furniture the only noise in the room. This is not a date, Mr. Jordan, she replied, her voice measured, almost distant. This is the way of the Quathari. We perform rituals to bond with the beings we serve. To care for them is to connect with them on a deeper level, mentally, spiritually, and physically. When we clean, we channel our energy into our charge, and in return, the bond creates a link between us. We offer ourselves to them in ways that extend beyond simple service. Jordan furrowed his brow, trying to digest what she was saying. Mental, spiritual, and physical? This was sounding more like a deep, mystical experience than just wiping down countertops. He wasn't sure whether to be intrigued or completely terrified. But Jordan stammered, I didn't hire you for anything like this. I just wanted help cleaning up. Vrexia tilted her head, her forearms still moving in synchronized grace. I understand, Mr. Jordan. But the ritual has already begun. It is not something that can be undone. The bond is now in place. Jordan was about to protest again when he realized something strange. His mind was clearer than it had been in days. He had been on edge, overwhelmed by the demands of his business and the chaos of his personal life. But now, with Vrexia's ritual unfolding around him, he felt a strange calm seeping into his thoughts. It was as though her presence alone was creating a soothing influence, like her energy was slowly bleeding into the very air around him. Vrexia continued her work, and Jordan could feel her movements becoming more deliberate, more intimate. She was no longer just cleaning. She was attuning to the space, adjusting the very atmosphere as if the room itself were part of a larger cosmic design. As she moved toward the bedroom, she motioned for Jordan to follow. Come, Mr. Jordan, she said softly. The ritual must continue. Unsure what else to do, Jordan stood up and followed her, his heart pounding slightly faster now. When he entered the bedroom, Vrexia had already started cleaning the bed, her motions slow and reverent, as if each fold of the blanket had profound significance. What exactly happens once the ritual is complete? Jordan asked, half curious and half anxious. Vrexia didn't answer right away. She focused on the bedspread for a moment, tracing patterns in the fabric with one hand, while another set of arms rearranged the pillows. Her amber eyes were unfocused, lost in the rhythm of the ritual. She only spoke when she finished her task, a soft sigh escaping her lips. When the ritual is complete, you will understand. The bond will allow us to communicate with ease, and you will have a deeper understanding of my people and their ways. But more importantly, it will allow you to find clarity. Clarity in your purpose, in your desires. Jordan blinked, confused. So, this is about finding purpose? He asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Purpose, connection, balance, Vrexia answered, her voice almost a whisper now. You are a part of this universe, Mr. Jordan, just as much as I am. This ritual connects us to each other and to the greater whole. You may not understand it now, but you will. Jordan was still grappling with the idea of his maid being a sort of mystical figure, but the strange sense of peace that had settled over him was undeniable. It wasn't like anything he had ever felt before. There was a deep stillness in his mind, an absence of the constant stress and clutter that usually filled it. It was almost as though Vrexia's presence was cleansing him from the inside out. He shook his head, trying to make sense of it all. Okay, but how does this ritual really work? I mean, I've seen sci-fi movies with alien cultures, but this seems way out there. Vrexia gave him a small, understanding smile. You will learn, Mr. Jordan. As the ritual continues, you will see things in a new light. You will feel what I feel. And, if you open your heart, you will discover a new path before you. The words struck Jordan like a revelation, but they only left him with more questions. As Vrexia moved to finish the ritual, he felt an overwhelming urge to ask more. Yet, for the first time in a long while, his mind stilled. He found himself waiting for the connection to grow, waiting for this strange bond to form. Whatever it was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The ritual continued, and Jordan found himself caught between curiosity and uncertainty. Vrexia's every movement seemed to unravel something in him, like the peeling of layers he hadn't even known existed. The apartment that had once felt like a cluttered, chaotic space now felt almost sacred, each corner imbued with a sense of purpose that he couldn't quite explain. As Vrexia moved through his home, the act of cleaning became something more than just an act of tidying up. It was as if she was weaving a tapestry of energy, connecting the very essence of the space with something beyond the physical. Jordan had always thought of himself as a pragmatic, logical person. He had never been one for mysticism, and certainly never for alien rituals. Yet, as the hours passed, he couldn't deny the growing sense of calm that had overtaken him. His anxiety, the pressure he had carried for months, was lifting. Every sweep of Vrexia's 4 hands, every hum that escaped her lips, seemed to wash away the weight he had been carrying. He had to admit, something was happening, something that defied his understanding. As she moved into the living room, Vrexia turned to him, her amber eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. Her face softened as if she had read something in him that he hadn't even acknowledged himself. Mr. Jordan, she said quietly, you are ready to accept the bond. It has been building with each task I complete, each action I take. Do you feel it? Jordan blinked, suddenly aware of how intensely his heart was beating. He nodded, though he wasn't sure if he understood exactly what she meant. I feel something, he said slowly, his voice unsure. Vrexia smiled, a small but knowing curve of her lips. That something is the connection, Mr. Jordan. You are beginning to understand. But now the final step must be taken. Jordan felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere. It was subtle but unmistakable. The air seemed heavier, charged with an energy that was both foreign and familiar. He instinctively stepped back a little, his mind whirling with confusion and a sense of unease. He had never been one for rituals or ceremonies, especially not those that involved him in such a deeply personal way. But something in Vrexia's gaze made it clear that there was no turning back. The ritual was near completion, and whether he understood it or not, he was involved. Vrexia, what do you mean by the final step? He asked, his voice low. Her gaze softened further, and she approached him with a calm grace. The bond between us must be sealed, she said, her voice almost a whisper. It is not enough to simply clean, Mr. Jordan. The ritual requires that we share a moment of unity, a mutual exchange of energy, of trust. Jordan's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced with the implications of what she was saying. A mutual exchange of energy? It sounded too intimate, too personal, especially with someone from another species. He wasn't sure how to react. He wanted to back away, to tell her this was all some misunderstanding. But there was something in the way she was looking at him, a quiet certainty, that made him hesitate. Vrexia's forearms reached toward him, and he instinctively took a step back, but she stopped. The expression on her face wasn't one of pressure, but of understanding. You need not fear the ritual, Mr. Jordan. It is not a burden. It is a gift. Jordan's mind was spinning. A gift? How could he accept such a thing? But even as the thought crossed his mind, he felt the weight of his own hesitation. There was something undeniably compelling about Vrexia's presence. He couldn't deny the calming influence she had on him, the strange sense of connection that had grown between them. I'm not sure I understand, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Vrexia nodded slowly, as if she had anticipated his confusion. I will show you, Mr. Jordan. With that, she closed the distance between them, and before Jordan could react, her forearms surrounded him, gently pulling him into her embrace. Her touch was warm, almost electric, and the moment her hands made contact with his skin, a surge of energy rippled through him. It wasn't painful, but it was intense. A deep, resonating sensation that seemed to fill every part of him. It was as though she was unlocking something inside him, something he hadn't known was there. For a moment, Jordan felt like he was floating. His senses were heightened, his mind sharp and clear. The apartment around him seemed to blur, fading into the background as Vrexia's presence became all-encompassing. Her amber eyes were locked on his, and he felt a strange pull toward her, a magnetic force that he couldn't resist. It was as though the very air between them had thickened, charged with a shared understanding. You are beginning to see, Mr. Jordan, Vrexia said softly, her voice distant yet close at the same time. You feel the bond, the connection. It is more than just physical. It is mental, spiritual. It is the essence of our beings intertwining. Jordan's mind struggled to keep up. He wanted to pull away, to question what was happening, but the feeling, the sense of peace, of understanding, was so overwhelming that he couldn't bring himself to do it. He felt as if he were being consumed, but in a way that didn't frighten him. It was a strange sensation, one that both comforted and disoriented him. He could feel Vrexia's energy, her very essence, flowing into him. The connection was undeniable now. It was more than just a cleaning ritual. It was a joining of two beings, something that transcended species, cultures, and even time. It was as though Vrexia was offering him something he hadn't even known he needed. And then, as suddenly as it began, the energy faded. Jordan found himself standing on his own 2 feet again, breathless, his heart pounding. Vrexia had stepped back, her hands lowering to her sides. Her amber eyes were soft, filled with a quiet satisfaction. The room was still, but it felt different now. The energy in the air had shifted, settled into a new equilibrium. Jordan's mind, once cluttered with questions and doubts, now felt clearer than ever. It was as though the ritual had wiped away all the noise, leaving only the core of his thoughts. Thoughts that now seemed more focused, more aligned. Do you understand now, Mr. Jordan? Vrexia asked, her voice gentle. Jordan nodded slowly, his words catching in his throat. I think I do. The bond had been formed. And though he didn't fully understand the depths of what had just transpired, he knew one thing for certain. His life had changed forever. The days following the ritual passed in a blur, but one thing was clear to Jordan. He was different. His perception of the world around him had shifted in ways that defied logic. The overwhelming sense of calm that had washed over him during the ritual hadn't dissipated. Instead, It had become a constant companion, a quiet undercurrent that ran through every moment of his day. He could think more clearly, feel more deeply, and somehow, everything in his life seemed to align with an unspoken purpose. Vrexia, however, was still an enigma. The connection that had formed between them was both comforting and unsettling. She continued her work in his apartment, but there was a certain distance now, a space between them that hadn't been there before. Jordan had expected her to be more present after the bond had been completed, but she seemed to be waiting for him to fully grasp the significance of what had transpired. He sat in his living room one evening, staring at the flickering holoscreen but not truly seeing it. His thoughts kept drifting back to the ritual, to the way Vrexia had held him, how her presence had felt like an infusion of pure energy. The connection they shared wasn't just emotional or mental, it was something deeper. But now that it was complete, it left him with questions that gnawed at him. What did Vrexia expect from him now? What did he expect? His thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of Vrexia's footsteps. She entered the living room, moving with her usual grace, her forearms folding across her body in a manner that was both casual and somehow ceremonial. She stopped in front of him, her amber eyes fixed on his. "Mr. Jordan," she said, her voice soft yet firm. "It is time that we discuss the nature of the bond. You have felt it, but now you must understand what it means. For both of us." Jordan swallowed hard. He had been waiting for this moment, though he wasn't sure what to expect. "I've been feeling things, Vrexia. Things I didn't expect. Things I don't fully understand." Vrexia nodded, her expression unreadable. "That is natural. The bond we share is a powerful force, but it is also an unknown. Your mind is adjusting to it just as mine has. But we must speak of what comes next, or the bond will become a burden instead of a gift." Jordan stood up, feeling the need to move to get some space to think. His mind was buzzing with 1,000 questions. "What do you mean? How could this bond become a burden?" Vrexia's eyes softened, and she approached him slowly, her movements deliberate and calm. "The bond we share is not one-sided. It requires energy to sustain it. Just as I have given you a piece of myself, you must now give a part of yourself to me. This is how we maintain the balance. But if you refuse, if you resist the exchange, the bond will weaken. It will fade, and you will lose the clarity you have gained." Jordan's heart skipped a beat. "You want me to give something of myself? What, exactly?" Vrexia lowered her gaze for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts. "The exchange is not as physical as you might think. It is a sharing of inner truths, of vulnerabilities. I have learned of your struggles, your desires. I have felt your pain, your fears. But now you must allow me to know you fully. In return." Jordan felt a cold wave of fear wash over him. The idea of letting someone or something see him so completely, so deeply, made him want to recoil. He had never shared his inner world with anyone, let alone an alien. His past was messy, filled with unresolved conflicts, ambitions that had failed, and a constant sense of being out of place in his own life. What would she see if he opened up to her? "I don't know if I can do that," he murmured, the weight of his hesitation heavy in the air between them. Vrexia's voice was soft but insistent. "You must, Mr. Jordan. The bond requires it. The exchange must be mutual. Only then can we truly understand each other. Only then can we grow together." Jordan took a step back, his mind reeling. He had already felt so much, so deeply. The clarity the bond had brought him was undeniable, but he wasn't ready to face his past, let alone share it with someone else. The vulnerability it required felt like a raw wound, one he wasn't sure he was ready to expose. "You don't understand," he said, his voice tight. "I've made so many mistakes. I've hurt people. I'm not perfect. I'm not even close. I can't just open up and let you see everything, not when it's so messy." Vrexia stepped closer, her eyes glowing softly. "I do understand, Mr. Jordan. I have seen your heart, your soul. It is not the mistakes that matter. It is the willingness to change, to embrace your true self, that is important. The bond we share is not about perfection. It is about acceptance. Jordan felt a strange pull toward her words, as if her voice were a tether that connected him to something greater. He wanted to resist, wanted to pull away from the idea of being that vulnerable. But there was something in Vrexia's gaze, something ancient and wise, that made him pause. It was as though she wasn't just looking at him, but through him, seeing everything he had tried to hide, and accepting him in ways he hadn't thought possible. "I don't know if I'm ready," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. Vrexia didn't press him. Instead, she took a step back, her gaze never leaving him. "You do not have to be ready, Mr. Jordan. I will wait. The bond will not fade. It will grow whether you choose to share with me or not. But the choice is yours." Jordan exhaled slowly, the weight of her words settling over him. He wasn't sure what to do, what to feel. He could feel the truth of her words, feel the sincerity in her voice. But was he truly ready to face the truths he had buried so deep? The silence between them stretched on, thick and heavy. Finally, Jordan spoke, his voice quieter than before. "What happens if I refuse? What happens if I can't give what you need?" Vrexia's gaze softened, and she shook her head slowly. "The bond will not break, but it will remain incomplete. And that will cause both of us suffering, in ways you cannot yet comprehend." Jordan knew then that he had no choice. He had to face the past. He had to open himself to Vrexia, whether he was ready or not. "I'll try," he said, his voice resolute. Vrexia nodded, her expression one of understanding. "That is all I ask, Mr. Jordan. You will not be alone in this. We will do this together." And with that, the next phase of their bond began. A deeper sharing, a deeper understanding. And Jordan couldn't help but feel that his life was about to change in ways he could never have anticipated. The days that followed Jordan's decision to try were heavy with anticipation and uncertainty. Vrexia had given him the space to prepare, though she never strayed far. Her presence lingered, both comforting and unnerving, as though she was a constant reminder of the weight of what lay ahead. Jordan spent his time pacing, his thoughts a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He had lived most of his life behind walls, afraid to let anyone see the fractures, the broken parts of himself. But now, with the bond firmly in place, those walls felt like a cage, suffocating him with their pressure. Vrexia, for her part, seemed to wait with infinite patience. She didn't push him, didn't demand anything of him. Instead, she continued her work around the apartment, moving in her fluid, ceremonial way. But it was clear she was aware of every moment, every shift in his energy. Every time their gazes met, there was an unspoken understanding, a silent invitation. But it was always on his terms. Jordan wasn't sure if he was ready. He wasn't sure if he could be. Every time he thought about sharing the truth, the depths of his failures and regrets, a cold knot formed in his stomach. But the clarity he had gained from the ritual, the bond, it pulled at him. He couldn't ignore it. Deep down, he knew that in order to fully embrace the connection Vrexia offered, he had to let go. The turning point came one evening when the weight of the bond felt too heavy to bear. He sat in the dim light of the living room, his fingers drumming nervously on the armrest of the couch. Vrexia had just finished cleaning the kitchen, the ritualistic movements of her work no longer a mystery but a source of quiet comfort. She had finished for the night, and now she stood in front of him, waiting. "Mr. Jordan," Vrexia's voice was soft, but it carried the quiet power of someone who had waited long enough. "Are you ready to share?" Jordan swallowed hard. The knot in his stomach twisted tighter. "I don't know if I can," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "It's not easy, Vrexia. There are things I've never told anyone. Things I'm not proud of." Vrexia didn't move closer, but her presence felt larger, more intense, as if she were somehow pulling him toward her without touching him. "The bond will not judge you, Mr. Jordan. You need not fear me. You need not fear the truth. But you must face it. For both of us." His mind flashed with images of the life he had led, the mistakes he had made. There were the failed relationships, the unspoken guilt that weighed on him, the choices he had made out of fear rather than conviction. There was the career that had never fulfilled him, the ambition that had always felt hollow. But what hurt most, what haunted him the most, was the knowledge that he had let people down, that he had taken the easy way out when things got hard. "I've been selfish," he said finally, his voice quieter than he intended. "I pushed people away when they needed me. I pretended to have it all together when I was falling apart. I thought that if I stayed focused on work, on success, it would fill the emptiness inside. But it didn't. It never did." His voice faltered as he continued. "And the worst part is I hurt the people I cared about most. I didn't even realize how much until it was too late." Vrexia remained silent, but he could feel her energy shift. She was listening not just to his words, but to the emotions he was laying bare. Jordan had never felt more exposed in his life. It was as though the very walls he had built around his heart had come crashing down, and for the first time, he was seeing himself through someone else's eyes. Someone who knew the truth, the pain, without judgment. Her voice broke the silence, soft and steady. "You are not alone in this, Mr. Jordan. Everyone carries their own burdens, their own regrets. You have walked your path, and though it has not been easy, you have learned from it. Your growth is evident. That is the gift of the bond. It allows us to see beyond the surface, to understand the complexity of each other's hearts." Jordan felt the weight of her words, and for the first time he didn't feel the urge to retreat. It was as if the fear of judgment had evaporated in the face of Vrexia's quiet understanding. And with that understanding came the realization that the bond they shared was not just about him facing his past. It was about finding peace in it, accepting it and letting it go. "I've spent so much of my life hiding," he said, more to himself than to her. "Afraid of what people would think if they knew the real me." Vrexia's gaze softened, her amber eyes glowing faintly. "You need not hide anymore, Mr. Jordan. The bond allows us to see each other for who we truly are. There is no shame in that." He inhaled deeply, feeling a strange sense of release. It was as if a weight had been lifted from his chest, a weight he hadn't even known was there. The bond had given him clarity, but it was also offering him something more, something deeper. It was offering him the chance to heal, to make peace with the parts of himself that had long been hidden away. Jordan stood up, his legs feeling unsteady as if the ground beneath him had shifted. He walked toward Vrexia, the space between them narrowing. For a long moment, they simply stood there, looking at each other. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but one filled with understanding, acceptance. "I'm ready," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'm ready to keep going, to face whatever comes next." Vrexia nodded, her expression serene. "You are not alone, Mr. Jordan. I will be with you every step of the way. The bond we share is a journey, not a destination." Jordan nodded, his chest tight with something he couldn't quite name. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. The fear that had once paralyzed him seemed distant, a shadow he could now confront. With Vrexia by his side, he was ready to face whatever truths lay ahead. He had no idea what the future would hold, but for the first time he felt like he could handle it. The journey was just beginning. The silence between Jordan and Vrexia was no longer one of uncertainty or hesitation. It was filled with an unspoken understanding, a shared anticipation that hung in the air like a palpable force. The journey they had started together was drawing to its inevitable conclusion, but Jordan knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning of something much greater, something that would change him and perhaps the world in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Jordan had learned more than he ever thought possible from Vrexia. She had not just helped him see himself, but had gently guided him to accept the darkness in his past, the mistakes that had weighed so heavily on him. The bond they shared had slowly unraveled his fears and self-doubt, leaving only the truth of who he was. And in that truth, there was no judgment, only a promise of something greater. As the days passed, Vrexia's presence in his life began to feel less like an intrusion and more like an essential part of his being. The connection they shared, the bond forged through trust, vulnerability, and energy, was something neither of them could ignore. They had come to understand that this wasn't just some ritual. It was the joining of two souls, two lives, in a way that transcended physical or even emotional boundaries. But now, standing in front of him, Vrexia's expression was one of quiet resolve, as though she knew the time had come for the final step of their bond. "You've made incredible progress, Mr. Jordan," Vrexia said, her voice soft but steady. "You've faced your truth, shared your burdens, and allowed yourself to be seen. But there is one final thing I must ask of you, something that will solidify our bond completely." Jordan's breath hitched in his throat. He wasn't sure what else was left. What more could there possibly be? He had shared his past, allowed himself to be vulnerable in a way he never thought possible. Yet, standing before him, Vrexia was unwavering in her calm. "What is it?" he asked, his voice filled with equal parts trepidation and curiosity. Vrexia took a slow step toward him, her four hands gently resting at her sides, as though she were preparing for something monumental. Her eyes glowed brighter now, the amber light almost ethereal in the dim room. The air between them hummed with an energy that he could feel deep in his bones. "This final step," Vrexia began, her voice laced with a soft reverence, "requires that you give the most important thing of all. You must give me your trust, unconditionally. You must surrender your fear completely and embrace the bond we share, not as two individuals, but as one." Jordan's heart raced. He knew what she was asking. This was the ultimate test, one that would demand everything from him. But there was no room for doubt in her words. There was no hesitation, no questioning. This was not about a ritual or a sacrifice, it was about a union, a merging of their beings as equals. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment to steady his thoughts. His mind flashed with images of the past, the fear, the failure, the moments of uncertainty. But none of that mattered now. The fear he had carried all his life had been gradually dissolved by the bond they had shared. His heart had opened, and he had realized something profound. The only way forward was to trust, not just in Vrexia, but in himself. "I trust you," Jordan said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions within him. "I trust you with all that I am, and I accept this bond, whatever it means, whatever comes." Vrexia nodded, her eyes filled with a depth of understanding that went beyond words. "Then it is done." With a soft, almost imperceptible movement, Vrexia stepped forward, her four hands coming to rest on his chest. The moment her touch made contact with his skin, the bond between them flared to life. It was as if a flood of energy rushed through his veins, an intense, electric sensation that surged through every fiber of his being. For a moment, it felt like his entire world was collapsing into a singularity. The physical world around him blurred, and all he could feel was Vrexia's presence, her energy intertwined with his. His thoughts scattered, replaced by a flood of feelings and sensations. It was as though their very souls were dancing together in perfect harmony, intertwining in a way that transcended everything he had ever known. He could feel her pain, her joys, her struggles, and in turn, she felt his. The room seemed to pulse with energy, the very air thick with the connection they shared. And then, just as quickly, it all settled into a profound, quiet stillness. The sensation was overwhelming but grounding. He was whole not just with himself but with Vrexia. He opened his eyes slowly, meeting her gaze. Her expression was serene, as if she had known all along what this moment would be like. But there was something else in her eyes, something tender, a sense of peace that he had never felt before. "We are one now, Mr. Jordan," Vrexia said softly, her voice filled with a quiet reverence. "In this bond, we are no longer two separate beings. We are one, united in purpose, in energy, in understanding." Jordan couldn't speak at first. The weight of her words settled deeply into his heart. He had expected a moment of revelation, something profound and world-changing. And yet, this was not a grand transformation. It wasn't about some dramatic shift in the universe. It was about the small, quiet peace that came from knowing, truly knowing, that he was no longer alone in his journey. Vrexia was a part of him now, as he was a part of her. The bond they shared wasn't just some mystical connection. It was a partnership, an understanding that went beyond physicality, beyond language. It was about growth, trust, and unconditional acceptance. Together, they would face the world, not as two beings, but as one unified force. "I understand now," Jordan said, his voice full of wonder and certainty. This isn't just about us. This is something that can change everything, everything I thought I knew about myself, about life. With you, Vrexia, I feel like I can face anything. Vrexia smiled, her 4 hands resting gently on his shoulders, grounding him in their shared reality. And you will, Mr. Jordan. Together, we will change everything because that is the gift of the bond. Not just for us, but for the world around us. Jordan felt a deep sense of peace settle in his chest, as if a great weight had been lifted. He was no longer trapped by his past or his fears. He was no longer bound by the limitations of his previous life. With Vrexia by his side, he felt ready to step into whatever came next, knowing that the bond they shared was more than enough to carry them through. And as the energy between them settled into a quiet rhythm, Jordan knew that, together, they had unlocked something truly extraordinary, something that would change not just their lives, but the very fabric of the universe itself.